Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 10th of August 2016, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish, and I will be joined by a live video Skype link by Dave Ellis from Strategic Defence Initiatives. And we better kick off with the weather. It's just started to rain here in Plymouth, so it's obviously summer, maybe not. We'll come on to that. But reports around the country seem to be mainly overcast. Well, often you learn what's really happening in the country simply by going for a walk with your dog. And I'm delighted to say that that's exactly what I did this morning. I met an old gentleman, 88 years of age, and we had an interesting discussion. Let's have a look at how that went. The elderly gentleman said to me with no prompting at all, "It's autumn already." When I was a boy, and that's some 80 years ago for him, when I was a boy, July, August and September were good months. Now we don't seem to have seasons. And then he said something which completely floored me. He said this: "I suppose they'll be blaming that on the Russians." And what did I think? I thought, this is remarkable. It seems to me that of course, wisdom comes with age, so that's one factor that we should consider. But surely, as a straw poll, this must mean that people are absolutely seeing through the propaganda of the BBC, which is pointing a finger at Russia at every opportunity. And as we're going to be hearing in this news, surprisingly, the Russian military threat didn't exist just a few years ago. How do we know that? Because our Prime Minister at the time, Tony Blair, was saying so. And we're now to believe that in the last few years, just a few 100,000 troops and some of the most sophisticated weapons the West has certainly seen have just popped up out of nowhere. Well, before we come on to that topic, let's remind ourselves that the British government is virtually in meltdown. We're getting some very interesting reports. What's the subject of the angst in Whitehall? Well, it is the subject of child abuse. And we should remind ourselves that, of course, the press and media in UK at the moment are just desperate to take the heat off Westminster, to take the heat off particularly MPs and the establishment. So we shouldn't be surprised to see stories like this one. This is the Mail Online pointing a finger at Australia because apparently there's been leaked files. Well, I suppose that's good news because the Australians haven't actually lost the files. There's been leaked files revealing horrific sex abuse and torture of children and women inside the Nauru's detention centre. So the spotlight is on Australian abuse. Of course, Mail, Guardian, Telegraph, Times don't really think there's any abuse in the UK. Well, pressure is moving on a number of fronts. We've got it on good authority that people have contacted the Foreign Office to ask them about the Doherty case, because, of course, the Doherty's 4 children were taken by armed Garda, armed police in Southern Ireland, and therefore this now becomes a matter for Boris Johnson's Foreign Office. And what we believe is that Foreign and Commonwealth Office staff have said that it's going to be the Foreign Commonwealth Office Policy Group that's going to respond regarding the stealing of the 4 children from the Doherty family. So we wait with interest to see what Boris Johnson's team says. He may say nothing, of course, which means that Southern Ireland has just been given the go-ahead to take anybody's children who visits there on holiday. And if we come in on a slightly different angle, and that will be with the Home Office, we can have a look at the Melanie Shaw case. And Melanie Shaw, as a child abuse whistleblower, we can now confirm is a political prisoner. I've put her number up on screen so that if anybody wants to write to her at Her Majesty's Prison, Foston Hall, they can do so. That number is Alpha 4126 Delta Echo A4126DE. And the reason we're flagging this up, remember the circumstances. She blew the whistle on horrific child abuse in the Beechwood Children's Home, Nottingham. And Melanie was one of several abuse survivors who talked about abuse in that and 8, 9, possibly 10 other children's homes, but they also mentioned MPs. And as a result of their testimony, of course, Theresa May, former Home Secretary, has done nothing directly to help them. But Melanie Shaw is now being held in Foston Hall. She's back in segregation. Her mail is being interfered with so that she is not receiving letters. And she, in one brief phone call she managed to make, she said that letters that she had written to a variety of people were simply returned to her a few days later. So, David, I'm going to say to you, we're going to move on to the subject of defence in just a moment, but let's consider that this is the real state of the Conservative government in Britain. Child abuse victims are not helped, they're not assisted, they're not held up in public as being immensely brave people. These are individuals to be harassed, beaten, threatened, and now, as we can see, incarcerated as political prisoners. Remarkable state of affairs, do you think?
It is. We've all got to consider, are we, do we want the rule of law or not? And, we've all got to think about what we're prepared to tolerate and what we think is acceptable. Because if you're prepared to tolerate this and sit idly by, ask yourself this: will your children be next?
That is the key statement, isn't it? And I think it's remarkable that we still have many professional, many very well educated people who seem to think that the state's ability to take children is a problem that's going to be experienced by people at the bottom of the pecking order, bottom of the social scale, and that they are somehow above this. Well, we should remind ourselves, of course, that the Doherty family, 2 professional people, school teachers, and they've had their children taken, not because of any abuse or neglect of their own children, but because they dared to report a person for being a paedophile or suspected paedophile north of the border in Scotland. Well, what does the government do if life gets a bit sticky? They lose things. So let's remind ourselves that we reported yesterday that documents had been lost. Not to worry, because those were just documents, files relating to, I described it as nuclear stuff, but they were documents relating to Israel and nuclear weapons. But oh dear, those have been lost. And at the same time, we've got our new Prime Minister clearly demonstrating an allegiance to Israel. Is there any connection between these 2 incidents? Well, of course, we don't know. But be it nuclear weapons or children, if life gets too difficult in Britain in 2016, then the documents simply go missing, which must be a criminal offence, malfeasance in public office at the very minimum. So let's have a look at our Prime Minister, identified by Mike Robinson a few days ago as one of the witches of Eastwick, seen here with our German counterpart, Angela Merkel. And we've labelled this the bubbling cauldron on the Russian front, because it's quite clear that there's been some very, very serious plotting in the background. And if I bring on one of the BBC's headlines, it says Russia-UK relations, May and Putin pledge to improve ties. So let's have a look at how the BBC deals with matters. It says the relations between the 2 countries have been strained, particularly following the UK inquiry, which blamed the 2006 poisoning death of former spy Alexander Litvinenko on Russian agents, and said it was probably approved by Mr. Putin. So lots of evidence there by the BBC. And it says other contentious topics have included Russia's support for the Syrian regime, the annexation of Crimea and fighting in Ukraine, and Western sanctions against Russia. But the good old BBC makes no mention of US, UK, and NATO troops and missile systems being aggressively placed right on the edge of the Russian border. David, we pointed out this before, that the actions over recent months, the last 18 months probably, by NATO, by the USA and UK, can only be considered as a hostile act, as weaponry has been moved right up to the Russian border. Why is that such a danger to Russia? Because, of course, it cuts down warning times should any of the red buttons be pressed. What's your take on this?
Well, they've treaded a rather bizarre and contradictory course and contradictory policy for quite some time. That we've had this radical cutting on the one hand, and yet we find ourselves then saber rattling, trying to poke the bear, and bear baiting, maybe we could even say that, and then having this, ridiculous void where the primary considerations of cutting frontline stuff that was fully operational, worked well, British systems like Harrier or the Ark Royal or whatever, then to find ourselves 2 minutes later, right, we've got this big bad enemy, Russia, and that's now a problem. And it's just utter nonsense. Who are they trying to kid? The only people they're trying to kid are the British people, because they're certainly not fooling the others.
Well, David, I'll just interject, if I may, because let's bring this headline up to really emphasise what you're talking about. We are supposed to believe from the Daily Mail that the Ministry of Defence, in a shock report, has just woken up to the fact that the Russians, let's consider the relative size of the army, Russian army, where are we, 10 times the size of Britain's army. We won't even bother to discuss tanks because the ratio is just too ridiculous to talk about. But apparently the Ministry of Defence has just woken up to the fact that actually the Russians have got some pretty powerful equipment and could defeat us on the battlefield. So let's just see whether I can bring some of that in here. We've got the Russian army can outgun British troops on the battlefield. We have got rocket launchers and other weapons at Moscow's disposal was superior to ours, while its mastery of electronic warfare technology was game-changing. That's a very interesting expression because there's been some real shock there. And a slated 3.5 billion fleet of British Army vehicles is apparently disproportionately vulnerable to Russian mortar and rocket fire. Now, if I've got that last one correct, this is the 3.5 billion fleet that Cameron crowingly announced when the NATO summit was taking place in South Wales. So we are to believe from the mainstream press in the first instance, but of course from the Ministry of Defence, that the little sleepy Ministry of Defence wasn't really sure what was going on in Russia. And they've just woken up, and it's a bit of a shock because apparently there is a Russian army and they've got some really good equipment. I am lost for words on this one. I'm going to have to smile. Are these people just ignorant, or have we got some form of brainwashing, some form of reframing of civil servants going on?
Well, there's certainly something very wrong. There's something very radically wrong across numerous factions, not just the civil service or the political interface. Because we're getting completely conflicting nonsense. Bob Stewart on Defence Committee told me at the end of last Parliament that Russia during the Blair regime had been de-designated as a threat, and that was the reason that the cuts could take place. So I said, well, that's total nonsense. It's just utter nonsense. Look at the production timescales of what we're dealing with realistically in Britain now on an engineering basis to make anything. It doesn't marry up. Your argument on the one hand doesn't marry up with the reality on the other of making things and paying for things and then getting rid of them at a whim, and then 5 minutes later we find ourselves, oh crikey, look, Russia's just got all this stuff, you know, and that's just popped up. It's nuts and nonsense.
Well, so, I can also ask, David, isn't this what we pay our intelligence services for? Aren't they supposed to be keeping tabs on what foreign powers are doing? We can apparently track some Arab gentleman down to a cave in the wild outback of wherever it is, Afghanistan, and we're capable of saying that man was organising an attack on Western society. But oh dear, we completely overlooked the fact that those Russians were rebuilding and producing a mere 15,000 tanks. This absolutely doesn't stack up unless what we're now starting to see is a deliberate policy to deceive the British public as to what's really going on in the world.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely what the score is. You know, I mean they're not fooling some of the ex top brass, you know, who have said some pretty interesting stuff over this period where they've been trying to saber rattle to Russia, and it's just mitigation. You know, it's political mitigation on the one hand for their shortfall and their shortcomings and their ineptitude, and you know we've got this underlying banking variance between the West and Russia and China and whoever. You know, that's actually at the core of this. It's an inability to overcome banking variance. But you know, when you look at the inner workings and the mechanics, we've got dear old Admiral Chris Parry in 2006 giving warnings to RUSI and members of Parliament and committee members and so on and so forth of various committees, warning in 2006 of what was going to transpire and what was going to take place. So this Admiral has done his job. His analysis at the time was absolutely 100% of actually where we are now in 2016 as to what's happening. And he was told to shut up, not just by the minister at the time, but by the civil servants. So, you know, we can draw from this some very, very succinct conclusions.
Well, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there, because, of course, some senior officers have actually taken risks in speaking out about this. And we have mentioned this very strange business of junior civil servants really telling senior military people to keep their noses out. We don't want to know your opinion. So we've got a very tight political clique around very few, increasingly few members of Parliament, and people with experience in the military really just being pushed aside. Let's have a look at what this gentleman said, because his name comes up in the Daily Mirror article. General Sir Richard Sharif accuses the government of, quote, hollowing out military capability. And he apparently told the Times, what we get from successive governments has been that it's all fine and dandy, and aren't we doing well? And actually, the reality is that our military capability has been dramatically hollowed out, to which I think we can add, isn't the General really describing treason? Because this is deliberately bringing the nation at risk. This is a government who are deliberately hollowing out the system. This is treason. This is not incompetence. This is something much more sinister.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a good deal of speaking out, and I've got to cite Admiral Sandy Woodward in 2010 saying that we could now not defend the Channel. And this is obviously, you know, he was being perfectly succinct. It was gone, you know, those warnings went unhindered. There's been a lot of others that have spoken out, you know, a great ream. So against officer advice, you know, we've got politicians and the other end of the civil service, because ultimately those officers are civil servants, you know, speaking out and saying, you know, this is the wrong thing to be doing. You know, it's causing sort of destabilisation, and they're ignored. You know, and we have this kind of oddness then of really the realities of the world that we're in, and this ridiculous argument of trying to use Russia as a mitigation whenever we please, to either, you know, go one way with them or go the other way with them, just because of whatever the economic wind blowing, you know, here in the UK and the West is. is an utter nonsense. We've got to seriously look closer and look better at actually what's going on. Now, Richard Sharif, to an extent, is correct by saying we've hollowed out. There is absolutely there's a consensus amongst all of the old guard that I spoke to, General Jackson and all of the others. Yes, we've gone too far, and it's now dangerous, and it's untenable. But it's the reasons for that, and the game that's being played further on, at the higher levels of government, beyond the politicians and so on, in the Treasury and the Bank of England. This is exactly what's going on with the money flows here and the problems that we've got with this banking variance with Russia and Iran and China and India, and how that's manifested in our political interface of our politicians. And I think we're going to, the two things coincide here with government bond yields being saturated and the volumes being so extreme in their size and magnitude to then get to a zero bond yield. That, are we seeing a convergence here of that problem? And it's manifesting in this saber rattling with Russia. All of a sudden we've got Russia, this terrible problem that's just cropped up in the last 5 minutes. Utter nonsense, because it's not. That we've now, okay, right, let's go off to war with Russia. It's madness, utter madness.
We've got, to put it in very simplistic terms, we've got international bankers saying we're in a bit of a fix. What we need is a good war so we can help take control again. We can drive up profits from munitions. We've seen it First World War. Many would argue we've seen it in the Second World War, and we've seen it in other wars. A distinct possibility.
Are they trying to use it once again, as right, we've run out of ideas, guys, let's just have a reset, we'll have a bit of a bash, and, but unfortunately this time round, it's a very different affair. We've got nuclear weapons, and the models of those kind of resets and games that we've had before, if you look at in our recent history, how we've, allied with France against Germany. Previous time round, we've allied with Germany against France, and then we've had, we've allied with Russia against Germany, and now, what are we doing? This is just bonkers. This is just bonkers. We can't do this time round with nuclear weapons. It is inherently going to cause some real serious, and this will of this sort of desire to press up to Russia with short-range tactical nukes. And that looks like it's the way it's going. It just isn't going to work for humanity. Whoever's sort of driving this has got to stop and have a real good think about how we're going to continue as a species. This isn't just about countries anymore. This is a species level problem.
David, you've used the word bonkers in our chat room. Somebody has just said that basically we're a nation being led by donkeys. I'm going to say, well, maybe, but this is calculated. The policy that's being brought in, this isn't accidental. This isn't incompetence. We've got some very, very dangerous people running Britain. They're prepared to be involved in criminal activity. They're prepared to cover up criminal activity. And as you say, they're now playing around with a very dangerous environment where we're moving tactical equipment up onto the borders with Russia. Well, let's just follow through how the propaganda is being pushed through to the British public. We'll join the Daily Mail again here, and let's have a look at what they say. Much as the BBC, really, the UK's relationship with Russia became increasingly strained under former Prime Minister David Cameron. So let's blame it on him. Following Mr. Putin's support for the Syrian regime, the Ukraine crisis, and the recent inquiry into the 2006 poisoning. So there is the line being spun, a government line. And again, we're just going to highlight it by saying no mention of aggressive NATO, US and UK troop and missile movements. So I thought we'd recap on some of the excellent slides that Mike Robinson produced a while ago. He was picking up, of course, on this one, dirty little deals behind closed doors in the NATO-Ukraine Commission. So this was all NATO starting to subvert, I think is the right phrase, countries of strategic importance and friendships to Russia. We've got David Cameron. Well, of course, he's speaking, so we know that he must be lying. Britain's membership of NATO is vital for our country because it helps to keep our nation secure and our people safe. But of course, he was well aware that really it was the membership of NATO that was vital because he and Tony Blair had destroyed British military capability, incapable of acting alone. And this one, well, he systematically destroyed Britain's military capability. Here he was saying, here at Warsaw, we've reaffirmed Britain's commitment to the alliance with concrete action to tackle the threats we face from Russia. Well, that couldn't be true because apparently they've only just woken up to the fact that, according to them, there is a threat from Russia. So we're not sure what's going on here. Or we could go on a bit. The multinational spearhead force that we agreed at the Wales summit is now operational. Remember, he's talking about 5,000 men, a mere platoon, really, if you want to call it that on the battlefield. It's capable of deploying anywhere on alliance territory in just a few days. So it sends a strong, clear message to Russia that NATO stands ready to respond quickly to threats. Well, of course, this is utter rubbish. Because what had really gone on is Britain's military capability to conduct any form of major war in Europe had already gone, and David Cameron knew that full well. And on he goes. We're a country that's willing to deploy its troops to reassure our eastern partners or to help countries further away. So nothing is too great for David Cameron. He will put British troops out there, except he didn't have any. And we've said here the fact we do not have any troops is a minor issue. Just let me get on with the politics. And we'll end on this one for this little subject, but the NATO summit. Here he is with Mr. Fallon. We've ruined the British military, but the US can put in the gear, the troops, and take the body count. And this is something which I personally feel very strongly about. We see British politicians standing and warmongering on the world stage, but of course, ultimately, who are the people who take the brunt of the casualties? It's Americans. David, please add to that whatever you like. Perhaps I'm being a bit too hard on Mr. Cameron, but I don't think so.
Well, certainly not being hard on him. I think probably not harsh enough. You know, we've had his cabinet was overzealously banking orientated, and you know, just look at all the people that he'd got in there. Look at their CVs, you know, and you can see exactly, you know, the banking orientation at that stage. So, you know, this continual duplicit nonsense, you know, is it inept or is it planned? You know, frankly, I think there's a handful of backroom boys that are conducting the actuary work. And they make sort of conclusions that you know, your average person, or you know, Tom, Dick, and Harry in the street, whether that be here in the UK or in America, would frankly just balk at. You know, this is a nonsense. You know, and you're right. You know, the Americans have seen huge impact on their folks being killed, maimed, and injured through these recent conflicts. You know, and where are we going? What are we achieving? You know, I think, you know, the consensus is now that the situation is far worse now than what it was before Bush and Blair started interfering. You know, but we've just got to look at the reasons for why they went in there. And, you know, I time and time again come back to this issue of Saddam trading oil in Swiss francs, or whatever the currency was. It's alleged it was in Swiss francs. You know, that seems to be the principal reason. But, you know, we come back to this nonsense with ping-ponging with Russia. You know, we had a situation with Maggie where she went over to Gorbachev and, you know, there was the famous sort of comment on the steps, you know, this is a man I can do business with. And she was executed before she got off the steps. You know, that was a game over for Maggie. You know, whatever we thought was the political margin for interface with her, finished right there and then with those comments. Whoever obviously took exception to what that may well have meant and interpreted.
Well, this is very interesting, David, that you're talking about Maggie Thatcher. So she got taken out because she certainly appeared. Yeah. She appeared to want to stand up for Britain. what her husband was up to. We're not too sure what the senior politicians around her were up to. We're not too sure. But that was Maggie Thatcher. Let's bring in Mr. Blair. Now, if you're of a weak disposition, I would say look away now. This is how he's reported in the Daily Mail. Grinning Blair soaks up the son at Italian tycoon's villa. So he's there with Sherry and daughter Catherine, and they're staying as guests of Fiat's former UK chief. So Tony Blair at his best. And we can now bring in some of the documentation which shows what he was up to. This is part of a paper written by a university professor called Fighting for Values, Atlanticism, Internationalism and the Blair Doctrine. And basically what this is saying, the connections between development and good governance, human rights, have been part of the Blair government's narrative and foreign policy from the outset. Our actions are guided by a more subtle blend of mutual self-interest and moral purpose in defending the values we cherish. In the end, values and interests merge if we can establish and spread the values of liberty, the rule of law, human rights, and an open society that's in our national interest too. The spread of our values makes us safer. So Tony Blair thought the best way to defend Britain was not by actually having a military, but by spreading his values. And I think we get a pretty clear idea of what those values are. And that was a paper presented to the ISA conference in Hawaii on March the 1st to the 5th, 2005, if anybody'd like to track it down. But David, prompted by your good self, we got into this a little bit more. And of course, we came up with this document, Delivering Security in a Changing World. And this was published in 2003. This is comment on it, I believe, by the same university professor. He says, a notable omission from the UK International Priorities document is a clear statement of the need to defend the state's territorial integrity. That's Britain they're talking about. The MOD white paper, Delivering Security in a Changing World, argues that there is no major conventional threat to Europe, but asymmetric attacks from terrorism pose a very real threat to our homeland. So there it is in black and white. In 2003, under Tony Blair and, in fact, Jeff Hoon, there wasn't any conventional threat. It had simply disappeared. This is part of the actual document. And if I just highlight the first bit, it says in paragraph 3.1, there are currently no major conventional military threats to the UK or NATO, but the threat from proliferation and international terrorism remains very real. This is absolutely remarkable stuff, particularly now when we see it in the light of day with hindsight.
It is, yeah, and you know, you're left with no ambiguity there as to exactly, you know, as to what the sort of situation is. I mean, you can overlap all of the different interlocking sort of factors and facets with that one statement. Yeah, it's just totally contradictory comment, policy, and analysis. It is just utter nonsense. And you know, from the question is, from whose point of view does what we perceive as nonsense make sense? And if you can find yourself getting to the situation where you can work that one out, then you know you can see the wood from the trees.
Right, and at the same time as that we're seeing this policy to simply wipe out Britain's military, we had the then European Union drive to break down these islands into fragments. So, of course, each element could be played against the other. So, we've got Wales, Welsh Assembly becoming a so-called free nation state. We've got Scotland the same, Northern Ireland under attack, and that was then followed on by David Cameron's Big Society, the communitarian drive. This was effectively, we'll call it communism. If people are not quite sure about the term, do research it. But essentially, the great lie was that we're going to give people freedom by devolving power to the lowest possible level. Well, no. What was actually taking place was that government power was being brought to the lowest level. So we get rid of Britain's armed forces, we divide up the islands into little fiefdoms, as somebody has described in the chat box. And then what we've got is a completely destroyed Britain. Meanwhile, David, your bankers can carry on doing all of the international fraud and corruption and drugs they need to. So let's just remind ourselves that Tony Blair, Mr. Cameron and others were a little bit confused about the Russians, and we'll put a picture up now. They thought that the Russian military had simply disappeared. So what was the response to this? Well, of course, it's breakdown in the procurement of working military equipment. So we'll remind people that our latest and greatest Type 45 warships simply don't work. They have a little problem that some of the seawater that's been warm for probably a few million years, well, they didn't realise it was warm. There's a bit, I suppose it fits with they didn't really realise that Russia still had military. But we have been told, and we'll tell our audience as an exclusive, apparently Mr. Putin has decided that he's not going to steal Britain's Type 45 technology. I'm not sure why. And then we've got a little bit of a problem with our submarine fleet at the moment because they're busy bumping into other ships. That's the ones that are at sea. And of course, we had this incident, which is much more serious than was ever reported in the press. Apparently, one of our Ministry of Defence officials said the trouble with submarines is they can't see each other in the water. But this is nuclear deterrent vessels in collision. And of course, the public was never told why a British and a French ballistic missile submarine, why were they sharing the same water? This is the key question, never answered. So these two submarines, it would appear, were deliberately put in close proximity because the chances of them bumping into each other on a pure statistical basis in the Atlantic is pretty small. So they were put in close proximity as part of, I would guess, a joint British-French exercise as part of David Cameron's 50-year defence pact with the French. We can then look at where our Navy is going. I've called it chaotic Royal Navy by design, but the uniforms are now being changed to make it easy, presumably, to hop out of your warship and into the nearest McDonald's. We've got Satanism approved. We've got an increase in bullying and violent initiations. We've got an increase in sexual relations on board. We've got a serious shortage of key personnel, particularly highly skilled non-commissioned officer engineers. We've got a serious shortage of equipment and spares. And we've got serious manpower shortages after private recruiting companies were given the contract. And of course, we've got an over-dependence on supposedly friendly foreign navies, such as the French. And we better say that we've got no operational aircraft carriers and we've got no maritime patrol aircraft. But David, this is simply because the Ministry of Defence has been a little bit confused. They've made a few mistakes, but if you're a common purpose future leader, for example, making mistakes is a normal part of everyday life. Should we just move on, do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Move on. Nothing to see here. You know, there's no risks. There's no anything. I mean, this is just total nonsense. You know, you look at the cold reality of over the last 20, 30, 40 years, how long it takes the MOD and BAE to make things. That is your principal primary factor. Okay, we can look at the money then as secondary, but the principal thing are the timescales. So, you know, we look at this situation that we've now got with the destroyers. Huge amounts of money, you know, absolutely huge amounts of money. Country's broke, and we've got them all tied up in Portsmouth, you know, and it's been put to me by, you know, what few TIFFs are left in the fleet. You know, don't they look lovely tied up there? You know, wonderful. There's no hope of fixing them because of no hope currently because of the current sort of situation. Now, in terms of the engineering, and it's been put to me by TIFS, that the engineering reshuffle and the way that the Pay 2000 program for artificers was enacted by Jonathan Woodcock, now the current second Sea Lord, which he oversaw all that review and reform, was that it left the TIFs basically, realistically feeling rather shortchanged with their pay, and they was some prevarication, I'm told, and they said, well, the attitude that was precipitated back to them, well, if you don't like it, you know where the door is. So consequently, a great deal of them have left. So what we're left with now is those destroyers, are just a white elephant. And how are we going to fix them? Can we fix them? Is it possible to be fixed? Well, you need engineers in order to do that. So, what we've got to do is we've got to sort of say to ourselves, right, Admiral Woodcock, what are you doing about this? This is your end. You're responsible for it. Is he responsible for it?
Well, let's just bring the gentleman up on screen, because, of course, the Royal Navy website very keen to show the senior officers. My goodness, he's got a lot of medals. And here he is, obviously talking to a young sailor. What's the occasion? Well, I think we can bring this in because he was appointed as Admiral in charge of HMS Victory. Now, I'm being quite serious here. This is what the article is about. And to be fair, this has been a historical appointment within the Navy, which is seen is regarded with great affection because, of course, HMS Victory is still there. But I couldn't resist bringing this on screen, that we've got a Navy which is failing because basically it's failing because we haven't got these very highly skilled engineers. They've disappeared, and they've disappeared for a reason, because the policy being enacted inside the Royal Navy has deliberately driven them out. I haven't got a huge amount of information on how this has been done within the Navy, but I understand that you're being told by certain individuals that quite a bit of this policy did come through this particular admiral.
Yeah, I mean, it's been put to me by TIFs that what's precipitated this problem goes back to the Pay 2000. It's apparently called the Pay 2000 program, and this is what's derived from it. And we've got ourselves now into a situation where how does this work out? You've got effectively a moribund service, and you've then got the some sort of Monty Python sketch playing out the other end at Whitehall, where they're now saber rattling that we're gearing up for a war with Russia. It's just utter insanity. Unless these people are so insane that they actually think that they're going to be using tactical nuclear weapons and get away with it, where are they going with this? If we come back to some of the fundamentals here about just wanting to get on, and people be living in peace and get on with their lives and have some money and so on and so forth. We see time and time again, Brian, we see this overriding and overlapping contradictory behaviour and contradictory policy. Blair on the one hand was a great example for this, because he cut like a knife-happy surgeon into the military, and by effect cut our industry, cut our means of making things, cut our means of making money, and for people to sort of live a life. And yet, on the other hand, he maxed the government stock and government debt into massive amounts, far greater than we've ever seen in our history. And while all this was going on, what was the opposition doing? Who spoke out about this quantity of debt that he issued in government stock? When you look at what was, Maggie Thatcher used to sort of prevaricate about printing money and government debt. She was overridingly wanting to get government debt down. But don't get me wrong, I'm not an absolute fan of Maggie Thatcher. Some of the things she did were good. Some of it was bad. Fortunately, we had Admiral Leach and Fieldhouse that stood to in the Falklands crisis, which carried her second term. But overridingly, one of the factors that was there, apart from her gaffe with Gorbachev about wanting to do business, was that she wanted to get the debt down in order that she would have a better margin for what policy she could interface with as a government. Now, of course, if you have massive amounts of debt like we have now, the margin for any government or the politicians to navigate in is reduced, because who's dictating terms? Terms is being dictated from the Bank of England and the Treasury, not from our elected members and through Parliament, because they hold the reins at that stage.
Yeah. Okay. Well, David, we'll just end on Mr. Woodcock, because, of course, he was awarded the OBE as Captain Woodcock, and this was awarded for training of Royal Navy personnel at HMS Raleigh, and particularly Marine Engineering School HMS Sultan. So he gets a gong from the Prince of Wales. We've got to be fair, we don't know. He may have been making policy which was closed down by the Ministry of Defence itself, but really what we've taken people through is the fact that there is something deeply wrong in the Ministry of Defence. And if we have prime ministers who are so ignorant of the world around them, they think that Russia and Russia's military simply disappeared. Somebody suggested they may well have been on cocaine. Well, who knows? But of course, if Britain's military is gone, the monster in the world is American military. But we understand that Russia's watching the American Navy very closely due to special operations. And here they are. We can announce that the Russians are running scared of the US Navy's transgender operations, because it's just been announced that if you're not sure whether you're a man sailor or a lady sailor or somewhere in between, the United States Navy is going to help you have a special operation. So on that cheerful and productive note, I can imagine that Mr. Putin is shaking in his boots. David, just 30 seconds summing up wherever you like to go.
Well, it's very simple. We've got to stop this nonsense of propaganda. We've got to be very, very careful with this Russian thing. You know, I've been told by numerous captains of nuclear responsible craft that at the end of what was the so-called Cold War, that a great deal of zero transition Russian devices were still unaccounted for. And that whilst Russia didn't have the targeting capability that was precipitated through the SDI and GPS system that was developed with the beginning of Trident, what they did have was sledgehammer devices that had massive yields. So there was never going to be any ambiguity. If the Western cabal and hive thought they were going to start something, that they were just basically going to get a very, very short, sharp shock. And in some instances, there would have been no warning. And I think this is what we've got to get back to, you know, stop this nonsense with Russia. They're not stupid. You know, they've apparently got this Magrev technology which will wipe stuff out anyways. You know, what are we doing? The only people we're trying to kid, you know, are our own people. And the politicians have got to stop this. They've got to raise their game, and we've got to get back on an even keel.
David, thank you very much for that. I'll just add to it, the only way that the politicians are going to get back on an even keel is if they're brought upright in a moral and intellectual sense by the British public acting. It's up to us to make that change. Well, we've had a strong focus on the military in today's news. One of the reasons for that is as we see the militarisation of Britain's police, and of course it's Britain's police who are kicking in our front doors, assisting bailiffs to steal our homes and our children. Ultimately, when the chips are down, we need our military to defend us. So if you're thinking, well, do we really need Britain's military? We certainly do. At the end of the day, these are the men and women who should be defending the British public against wherever the threat is, and that includes danger from our own government. So we'll end there. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a reminder that we still have UK Column t-shirts for sale. So if you haven't got one of the latest design, have a look on the website. And if you can purchase one, we'd be very grateful, as that helps us do what we do. And if you're not yet a subscriber, perhaps you'd also considering taking out a subscription to allow us to bring more news to you on a daily basis. Thanks for joining us. We'll be back same time tomorrow. Bye-bye.